I'm Sean Hall, Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. You can find out everything there is to know about the VBC on our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. Welcome to the VBC's Lioness, the Origin Story. This is a special podcast dedicated to telling the history of Lioness vets from their point of view. Over the course of this series, we'll cover everything from Team Lioness to female engagement teams and the cultural support teams. Our goal is to shed light on this unexplored history. Joining me again is filmmaker and writer Daria Summers. In 2008, Daria Summers, along with her filmmaking colleague Meg McLagan, released Lioness, a documentary that revealed the history of a group of women support soldiers who went to Iraq in 2003 as mechanics, clerks, and engineers, but ended up serving as the original Lioness soldiers. Although the Lioness's mission was to defuse tensions with Iraqi women and children, they fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the Iraq War. Daria is joined by Shannon Morgan, who was a member of the original group of Lioness soldiers, an Army mechanic from Mena, Arkansas. She served in Ramadi from 2003 to 2004. During the 2004 battle for Ramadi, she was one of the group of Army Lioness soldiers attached to the 2 Marines during house-to-house searches. That put her at the center of some of the fiercest street fighting of the war. I'm going to hand it off to Daria here, and she's going to introduce our special guests for the podcast today. Thank you so much. Take it away, Daria.
This is an episode I've been secretly waiting for and very excited to get to. Our last episode was about the rescinding of the 2013 Combat Exclusion Policy for women. So this is a perfect point, I think, to look back at the women who helped get us there. And so today we have as our guests 2 of the original members of Team Lioness and women who really contributed to the catalysts that helped get us to the rescinding of the Combat Exclusion Policy. Kate Guttormsen retired from the Army in 2020 as a colonel after 24 years of service. Her last post was as the director of the Army University Press and the editor-in-chief of the Military Review, but I know her best from her service as a captain in the 1st Engineer Battalion, who served in Iraq from 2003 to 2004, during which time she was a leader of the original Team Lioness. And Colonel Anastasia Breslow-Kynaston is currently serving as a colonel in charge of G6 Communication Operations Division, where she is a chief. And when I knew her best, when we were making the film, she was a 1st lieutenant and serving as an original member of Team Lioness. And all of that was basically about 20 years ago. So I thought this is a perfect time to, look back and see how things look now with the perspective of time. And I thought one of the questions I could kick us off with was, given that it's been 20 years and that you both played key roles in the original members, I think you were both the highest ranking women in Team Lioness. And so I just wanted to know, when you look back, and even back from, I know when we recorded our interviews with you in the film, say 2000, we started in 2005, 2006, it was over those years. So that was maybe 3, 4, 5 years out. But now, what's changed about how you look at it? What are some of the thoughts you have? Are there any headlines? Because I know that in the, sorry, I'll just add this in. I know that when we were doing the press for the film, and one of the things was that women you didn't have proper training, and it was sort of an ad hoc, like you had to get the mission done. Colonel Brinkley was like, well, I have these women who can fulfill these roles because of the cultural norms. We need them. But Kate, you had something very interesting to say about training.
Yeah, I think, good morning, by the way. It's good to see you guys.
Sorry, good morning. It's very good to see all of you.
Yeah.
Good morning. It's good to see you too.
I think when we started getting the publicity back in the day, we didn't really know until they shot the cover. Aaron Solero was in theater as an embed in the spring of 2004. And then 4 of our women were selected to be on the cover. I think it was the Marine Corps Times at the time, highlighting Lioness. And then I really don't think we understood how much dialogue was going on in the DC area until we screened the film and we saw all the media footage that you guys had put together in the documentary. But one of the things that was routinely highlighted and has been talked about as I've participated in screenings and Q&As over the years is the lack of training that we had for the mission. Almost kind of like we were victims thrown into a situation and had to kind of figure it out. And I never felt that way about it personally. I felt that there was a need based on situation on the ground in Iraq. We were able to fulfill the need. And then thankfully we were successful in doing so, because had we not been, this conversation could be occurring 10 years down the road from now. So the fact that I think that we were successful back then was attributed to when then I got further stationed at the National Training Center 2 years later. We were then training women, to go and do this mission. So it caught up with the Army. That being said, I always like to highlight the Army is a learning organization. We after action review everything. I had many soldiers, men and women, in theater in Iraq in 2004 that were asked to do things that they had zero experience with. I had a decontamination platoon that was attached to me that was the firefighting platoon for the base camp. They were cleaning porta potties. I had young male soldiers that had talents, and I figured out how we could use them best to solve problems on the ground. So as the Lionesses went out and we started learning what we needed to do on the ground and what the maneuver units wanted them to do on the ground, we were able to come back and kind of fine tune rehearsals with the maneuver units and get better. So where we started, the first mission, October 11th, 2003, and where we ended before we redeployed in August and September of 2004 was tremendous. And I would bet that every single one of the women that participate in one of these missions would feel the same way. Like, we just got better at what we did, no different than any of our male counterparts and anything that they had going on. But it was very deliberate. The Army was very deliberate about learning from our mistakes or capitalizing on successes and then just getting better at what we do.
So my follow-up question to that is, in part, you were, this was 2003. So you were like the first, like the first wave in, which on some level, aside from the fact that they were drawing on women because, they needed them because of the cultural sensitivities. But I would imagine that to some degree, across the board, everybody was learning.
Oh, yes.
And so that was just, that's how these things function.
You train the best you can, but the enemy gets a vote, as we always say. And, war is, you have to be adaptive and flexible, in any type of military situation, I would argue. And that part of, the art of it is learning and adapting and then being successful on the ground. But everybody in our organization was asked to do something that we didn't train for. Guaranteed.
No, I definitely get that. And I think, Stacy, I think that one of the things in the film, especially, there is that one sequence where you're talking about, there was a large missile. I don't have the right name for it. You'll have missile launcher, and but you would have to say, and you were kind of left there because it wasn't, the Marines weren't quite this. I guess this would have been in 2004 in the March, April, May kind of battles. You were left alone, and suddenly you realized if you had to fire this, you wouldn't really know how. And I think it's that jump that, and I think probably a lot of that, when you were out with the Marines, and an intensity that probably was like much further out than you'd anticipated at that time, where people got the idea, well, yeah, they weren't trained, but how does that look to you now? How do you understand that now?
So looking back, it's so much more nuanced than that. And it goes to what Kate was saying, where, you know, we were trained, but we had to adjust and adapt. What I've seen, especially listening to the previous podcast and what the CSTs and the FETs went through also, is it's less about the individual training. I remember we were doing an interview and the way they phrased the question, they were asking about our training, but I think they asked if we felt comfortable in combat. And I honestly felt comfortable in combat because the noise and the individual training that we'd gotten, you know, made me feel prepared for the scenario of being in combat. But we weren't integrated with the teams. So it's the collective training that a unit does together. We weren't involved in the mission planning. We didn't cross-train with the systems that they had in the units that we were supporting because we weren't integrated from the ground up. And so at the time when I was talking about how being in combat and how the sights and sounds and everything, I wasn't uncomfortable or afraid. I thought I'd gotten off message. And then looking back now, I realized it's because the training deficit that we were facing wasn't at the individual level. You know, Shannon being the most experienced saw gunner, it was at the team and collective level and being integrated. And then listening to the CSTs and the FETs and talking about all this additional training that they had to be really great, and then still facing the challenges of integration and not being used properly because they weren't at necessarily all of the levels of training up to the collective exercise with the battalion, and knowing the team from the outset, that is the real challenge that we've got to face. And having the women integrated and being able to assess into these branches immediately should solve that problem in the future.
That makes a lot of sense. And that brings me next to like something that you wrote, Kate, because you said when you were transitioning out, right, and you had that conversation with a brigadier general, and he said, well, I never thought I'd be talking to you.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Right. Tell us a little bit more about that, because I'm just wondering, in a conversation like that, in other words, did you bring something up like this?
So I think it was,
did Stacy, did you?
I think in this particular event, it was very deliberate. It was June 1st of 2004. And Colonel Brinkley was going to be meeting with the incoming chain of command that was going to take over for us in Ramadi. So it was the 2nd Infantry Division, 2nd Brigade, the 2nd Infantry Division, Assistant Division Commander for Maneuver was General Jordan at the time, and then their staff. And Colonel Brinkley told me to grab a couple of the Lioness ladies, and we were going to go have lunch in the DFAC. And this was, for me, I realized at the time it was really significant because I have an entire journal entry about it. And there was a private space in the back of the dining facility on the camp. And it was just the leadership, me, Shannon, and Rainey. None of the handlers were there. You know, there was no, you know, so it was just us having a private conversation. And we talked a lot of things. We talked about a lot of the different mission sets we had as a headquarters company, and, you know, all the multitasking we did and things that we didn't know we were signing up to do when we deployed. But a significant portion of the conversation was Lioness. And I had Shannon and Rainey on the ground, who were able to talk through a lot of the different missions that they had participated in to date. And towards the end of the conversation, General Jordan, you know, everybody's quiet when he starts to talk. He looks at all of us and he says, I never would have imagined having this conversation with you. You guys are changing the Army forever. And I mean, it was huge at the time. We were like, we just kind of all looked at each other, and we were floating, you know, back to the barracks afterwards, because it was just, it was a positive conversation. There was no discussion about policy at the time. It was a need. We were fulfilling a need. We were doing it well, and they were proud of us. And it was tremendous, because I think Rainey and Shannon, hopefully they both remember that, you know, they went back and they were able to send that message and carry that message back to the rest of the gals that were supporting those types of missions.
Wow. I mean, that must have been a huge moment for you. And so at that point, and so Stacy, you weren't in that meeting, but did that message get back to you? Did you know about that? Or, I mean, I guess I'm trying to, like, that seems like maybe like the inkling that there was some, what you had done during your deployment as lionesses was gonna start to resonate.
I feel like there were so many things going on while we were there, and it was hard to put it in a larger context. And so
Right.
even now, because day to day, working my job and raising my girls and trying to be supportive of Merlin's career, I just haven't had the time to really reflect on everything that we did and what it meant in context. So the podcast itself, listening back to the previous 10 episodes and reading the Lioness Impact Report, I generally minimize when I'm talking to people my contribution because, it just feels like to me, a footnote in history. But when you look back and you see the progression from the Lioness to the FETS to the CST and the changes in policy, and looking at what you, Daria, and the team did with just putting forward all of the impacts and the lessons that you learned, it's much wider than I had originally thought. The impact that Lioness and what we did in changing how the Army looks at this. And I never put those connections together because, living through it and just being stuck in the day to day, it seemed to me that it was inevitable at some point, but someone has to take that first step. And, this was important to that first step.
I think that's absolutely right. This was like, and sometimes I feel like, there are other instances in history when that first one thing happens, and certainly women have taken, and I want to put this in the larger context, there were women making huge advances by sheer will in the Gulf War and previous and previous conflicts. But there's Shannon is with us now. Fantastic.
Hey!
I had just been talking to Stacy and Kate about, we were looking back about how the Lioness missions look now and how looking back at them has changed over time, because it was just, a first step. And I was saying for myself that when the film came out in 2008, our advocacy work, with Meg, up on the Hill, I know Stacy and Shannon, you were there. Kate didn't make it, but you were there at other instances. It was really focused on healthcare and the recognition, how getting proper acknowledgement, whether it was for Nava because of her hearing, or for Shannon, or for anyone who'd really been in some of that those combat situations, and getting it recognized so they could get VA benefits. And that's what we were focused on. But when I started to do the podcast, I suddenly started to understand it in terms of, wow, from 2003 to 2013, like the Lionesses and the progression to the FETs, the female engagement teams, and then the cultural support teams, they all were operating on this edge and with this ambiguity of, yeah, we need you to do these things, but technically the policy says no. And so you were operating, and I had many female engagement team members tell me that, they would be sent out and then they would be pulled back because someone would come to the camp to visit. So it just gave me a different perspective. And I was wondering if that had occurred to you.
I think what I saw was we redeployed in 2004 and I got restationed at the National Training Center in 2006. And I think I saw you guys at Fort Stewart, Georgia, and we did some filming there. And at the
Yes.
time, we had women who were still, serving whatever organizations they were serving in their military occupational specialty, but they were also assigned as Lioness soldiers, and we were training them on how to conduct searches, for example, and how to properly search, Iraqi women.
And we have some of that footage in the film.
Yes. So I felt pretty good that, within 2 years, even though policy was not there, the feeling of the Army and the National Training Center is kind of tip of the spear for training units before they deploy, felt that, these women were going to be doing this, so we're going to prepare them the best we can before they deploy. And that was good. So I felt like leadership in general knew that we were doing this. Never was the intention that they roll out of the gate serving as infantrymen. They were rolling out the gate supporting maneuver units to interact with women and children in the battlefield in whatever capacity that was. To this day, I still think Shannon and Rainey and some of the other women in April 2004, that was just very unique situation because Ramadi just went, it was crazy. We had everybody kind of dismounted, moving around Ramadi, engaging with enemy forces. But typically, the Lioness teams, Rebecca Nava went out of the wire a lot and handed out soccer balls to schools and kids and did things like that. So they didn't always find themselves in the unique situations that some of our teams did up front. And I think we learned and adapted on, how to try and control them a little bit better, where we position them in a convoy, how they interact after the maneuver forces go in and seize, a home and get it under control before the women, walk in and then control the women and children. So we just continued to learn, but I absolutely felt that the leadership, at least the leadership that I saw, and I was still captain and then major at the time, so a much lower level, but I felt like everybody was on board trying to do the right thing and get these women trained to do what they're going to do when they deploy, regardless of what policy said at the time.
Right. And I feel that there was from the outside perspective looking in and talking to people like Captain Lori Manning, who was involved in a lot of the policy and the Washington stuff, it was like, there were two separate worlds, and the armed services, they just needed to do what they needed to do, and they just wanted the politicians just just kind of stay put, because otherwise, it would disrupt their whole operation, so to speak. But Stacey, I just wanted to ask you, where were you in 2013 when the combat policy exclusion for women was rescinded? And do you remember, was that wow, okay, let's see what happens now?
I believe I was at Fort Campbell, and I was the rear detachment commander for the 101st Division Support Battalion. So, and I had my, it was 2013, right?
Yeah.
I was pregnant with my first child.
You too, right, Kate?
No, I had just had Gabriella after this happened.
Oh, okay.
So I remember thinking that it was incredible and that I hoped we would be able to assess enough people in, because that's always the challenge, right? It's getting people to want to be a part so that they're not excluded or treated as other, because there's just so few of them in the organization. But like I said, I honestly, most of those things pass me by as I'm stuck in the day-to-day grind of whatever's going on. So with the division forward in Afghanistan for another rotation, I was very knee-deep in what was going on day to day.
Well, it's interesting because as I've talked to and I've tried to kind of create the arc in the podcast anyway, from the original stories and the profile of the original Team Lioness in the Army, and then the Marines and female engagement teams and cultural support teams. One of the things is that I remember this with you, Stacy, because I have a lot of the pictures of you out with the little kids, pictures of you and little kids. And I imagined you possibly out with Nava, or I don't know which missions, but, that were more like meet and greets, or, sort of community, extending yourselves into the community. And I guess what I'm trying to say is there were certain elements. I mean, everybody focuses in now, oh, where was the combat? But there were all these other elements, and then you see those kind of more developed and being utilized more formally as a kind of like, yeah, let's see how we can do that when it comes to female engagement teams. Because in Afghanistan, they went out a lot to see what did women need, what were their medical needs, how were they doing, and I feel like that was extension of that. In other words, that community relations in a way, and becoming known, and so that's why I'm always fascinated, because I really, and this is how I see it from the outside, but you guys tell me how you see it. Is this really evolutionary sense of how continuing to understand how women can be used in this kind of landscape to get a better handle on, where you are, the population you're dealing with.
So, and I misspoke earlier. 2013, Genevieve was one. I just had her, actually. I had her in 2012. So, yeah, new mother, was not paying attention to anything.
Busy mom.
Yes, yes. When it comes to the FETs and Afghanistan and how they were using them in that context, I think, that entire theater of the war was so different than Iraq. Before I got to Fort Campbell, I had worked with 189th Infantry Brigade, and they were doing the provincial reconstruction teams. So I was training 12 commanders to go take 12 provinces in Afghanistan, and we were partnering with Department of States and USAID to make sure that their personnel that were going to deploy were embedded and integrated with the provincial reconstruction teams, and some of them were female. I remember Paula Lloyd, who was actually killed in Afghanistan after we had our training in 2009, was one of the USAID workers that had come out and was training with us and learning how we spoke and how to embed with her team. So, for the more austere environments, it made a lot of sense to have military women out there who had experience with the weapon systems. And we were trying to get the USAID and the Department of State personnel integrated and understand how our radios worked, because there was an incident, I believe, in Kabul, where a team had been hit and all of the military were injured, and you had the one Department of State guy who didn't know how to operate the radio, couldn't call for help or anything else. So very similar to our systems, except this is a man. He's just not integrated with the team. That, based on that, we, as Kate was saying, is flexible and adapt. So now when we're doing this train up for these provincial reconstruction teams at Fort Liberty, they are trying to bring in the Department of State and USAID workers to integrate with the teams ahead of time, so that they understood our systems and could help themselves and help the team in situations like that.
Wow, that's, because you didn't work 2003 to 2004, you weren't anywhere near like State Department or the USAID people, were you? Or that was still early days?
It was early. They were operating around us, in and around us, and they would use the base camp kind of as a safe spot to come and resupply and rest, and then go out on their missions. But very rarely were we supporting them. I think a few times some of the maneuver units might set up a cordon on, so that these guys could go in and, execute a mission. But that was kind of the extent of it. And certainly we, didn't know a whole lot of the details regarding it, other than giving them food and shelter and fuel and getting them back out the door.
Ironically, just on a personal note, I'll mention that Iraq was the last call that my father got from the State Department to come back in and work for him when all this, because he had worked for USAID, and he didn't want to do it at the time, but I do remember that. It was just and then it was very interesting because it just seemed like the Wild West, especially for USAID people, but probably good he didn't go. But shifting the conversation a bit, I was just wondering, so now when you look, so because Kate, you got out in 2020, so but during that time, after the rescinding of the Combat Exclusion Policy, and then 2015, when they the policy became gender integration, which, I mean, and I know the whole point is like, it didn't happen like that. It took, all the services had to review and study. But have you witnessed the changes? I mean, in other words, have you looked back and it's like, well, if I had those opportunities, I might have done this or I might have done that? Or have you just, noticed how it's changed things, or maybe it hasn't been that big a deal?
Oh, no, it's a huge deal.
That's what I thought.
It's a huge deal. I remember I had just gotten stationed in the Pentagon in March of 2013. And I remember grabbing coffee with Dave Brinkley at the time, who had retired and was working on gender integration. And we went and had a cup of coffee, and he brought all these slides, and he was showing me how women were going to start Ranger School. And I just remember being super excited, but also a little bit jealous, because I was one, as a second lieutenant platoon leader with a bunch of my peers from West Point in Korea back in 1997. There was only one platoon that I could lead in that organization because I was a woman, and that was the only reason why I got that platoon. So I remember the frustration of not being able to do what my male peers did, and given those opportunities, I felt like I wasn't going to have the same chance at a career as they would, because I would never have an opportunity to command line units. So having that conversation with him in 2013 and hearing about the women that were going to have all these opportunities to attend all this formal training that the Army offers at the highest levels was delightful. And there's a whole network of women supporting these women as they are the first to do all of these things. And I would like to say that the majority of women feel the same way, that we're very supportive of it. We're so happy it's happening. It's long overdue, because at the end of the day, as a leader, you want to maximize the talent you have in your organization, regardless of, any personal features they have, and figure out what they're good at, and then, have them do it. So that your organization is as successful as it possibly can be. So it's pretty awesome. And now we have women serving at the highest levels of the Army. The Secretary of the Army is a woman.
Right.
So, I mean, it's
now the head of the Coast Guard.
Yes.
I mean, that's...
all the professional, all the military schools have women on the senior level staffs. We are now everywhere. And it's awesome.
Right. And so, Stacy, just being at Fort Liberty, have you seen, because I know that when we first met you, you were out in Kansas, right?
Yes.
So, but you were born at Fort Liberty, which was then Fort Bragg, and you are now at Fort Liberty, and also your husband, Lieutenant Colonel Kynaston, is what is his command post there?
He is in charge of the 50th Signal Battalion here at Fort Liberty.
So I love it because it's this dual, like you, Kate, a dual military couple, and but I, how do you think I mean, it seems like in your examples that the Army, when it can, is accommodating that, because clearly they've invested a lot in each of, before you retired, certainly they've invested a lot in each of you.
So
How
we
is that?
are very fortunate to have supportive commanders and supportive leadership at all levels, honestly, to keep our family integrity as much as possible. And we've been able to do that and find jobs where we can work together. What's fantastic is right now, my boss, Brigadier General Sutton, who, when she was a lieutenant, worked for my dad when he was the DBC of 35th. So, you know, there's connections there. She is dual military, and she is the senior signaleer on Fort Liberty. So it's fantastic. And then for the senior signaleers on Fort Liberty, there's Brigadier General Sutton, and there's 4 colonels, 3 of which are female right now. So, you know, there's a lot of support system and a lot of changes happening at the senior levels. And what's amazing about having the Combat Exclusion Policy lifted and having all of the branches open up to females is, if you look historically, combat arms are going to be the Chief of Staff of the Army. And, you know, without those being lifted, there was one path. Aviation is combat arms that females could be in, potentially as a path to the most senior levels in the Army. But now it's wide open to have that possibility of having a Chief of Staff of the Army who's combat arms and female. So, you know, the opportunities and the shift in the mentality is impressive. So we get a lot more support for females and dual military, just because you see more people in the leadership levels who have an understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be a huge sort of awareness and leap forward in terms of really holding together, you know, individuals which, like, maybe have already been invested a lot. Like Kate, you went to West Point and you got all this training, and you were, I mean, imagine if you know, if they hadn't been so accommodating, you know, how would that, you know, and you were married and you had kids, how would that have worked out? And even for you. And so I think it's like amazing, because it's not just a matter of what one partner or the other is going to, you know, wants to do. It's like you've been invested in. At a certain point, you have an amount of expertise that might take another 10 or 15 years to get someone else to that point. So it's like, I mean, I just feel like that's an important point to raise, because it makes it, you know, it makes a difference about how you know, how you keep people, good people, long term.
The Army, as you know, a few years before I started transitioning out, the Army recognized this, among other things, and just started doing a much better job at what they call talent management. But when I was growing up in the Army, and then when Doug and I got married, we had to be pretty flexible. Like, we knew that our family came first. And if the Army wasn't going to be supportive of us staying together, then we either one or both of us would exit. And that was kind of a decision we made. We felt that the success of staying together was always tied to generally one of us taking a bigger role, and the other one kind of taking whatever role the Army was willing to give us at the time. But I will say, when I was stationed in the Pentagon, Doug was getting ready to take command, and the Army wanted me to go do a job, and they were going to have us about 200 miles apart. And it took my senior leader, who at the time happened to be the Chief of Staff of the Army, to get involved, to get Doug and I, and Kathy, who's helping facilitate the podcast with Stacy there, was working with me at the time. But, you know, we had to get him involved to keep us together. But we were very prepared to walk away from the Army at the time with everything we had invested, which at the time was a combined 40 plus years, probably. if they weren't going to make it work for us. I think we've gotten better at it. Stacy probably can talk about it a little bit more. I think they targeted young families. They want to make it work. They want to keep people who want to serve in the Army. They want to keep talent in the Army. So I think at the lowest, most leader levels, they want to make it work. And then, you know, when people get in a bind, I think there's usually somebody in the chain of command that's willing to help to make it work. But the other things I would say have gotten so much better since my time, and Stacy when she was younger, is, you know, daycare has gotten better. Paternal leave is out there now. Longer leave for women after they have babies is out there now. You know, soldiers can go get help with infertility. There's just so much going on in a good way now for women and families in the Army than we had years ago.
That's fantastic. I mean, and I want to pull Shannon in here because I know you're hearing us talk about this, and you were, and especially this last time I'll go back to it, but Kate and Stacy both talked about, you know, where they were and what the rescinding of the combat exclusion policy meant to them. And I was just wondering, I wanted to get, because you left shortly after you returned, you left the military shortly after you returned home, but I know that you've followed things and are aware. And I was just wondering if you had questions for them, or if you could, you know, tell us about, were you aware of that? How momentous was that for you when it happened? Or maybe it was not.
Well, in 2013, I was in Oklahoma, and I remember getting a phone call from one of my friends that was like, hey, did you see the news about the combat exclusion policy being rescinded? And I like literally did cartwheels over it. I was like, you're kidding me. This is literally what we went on the Hill to have done. I'm like, yay, they finally accomplished the mission.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I know that, like for Stacy was saying, it just felt like the Lioness in terms of your long career and all that you've done. And I know that I see you, I look at you, it's like, oh, you know, you were a Lioness. But like, on the other hand, I don't really know what I'm talking about in the sense that you've had this long career and you're a colonel, so you've had all kinds of other accomplishments. And the Lioness was just something that happened between 2003 and 2004, but it did, you know, it kickstarted, it contributed, you know, it put in, it was a big push, and it was just really set off, I think, a kind of domino effect that helped inevitably. I mean, it just made it inevitable. Like it wasn't sustainable without doing this. And I think that's what, because the combat exclusion policy, you know, when the ACLU filed it, and of course it had gone on, there had been people talking about it for a couple of years about filing things before then. But after the ACLU filed it, like, you know, 2 months later in January, I think it was filed in 2012, in January, Leon Panetta was like, okay, we drop it. Not a problem.
It was long done. It was just a formality at that point.
Right, because it was really like, okay, let's clear the plumbing, so to speak. And Stacey, I also wanted you to tell us about, because you're more than just a Lioness. I just wanted to tell us about like kind of a thumbnail sketch of your career and your work and some of your accomplishments, and that have led you to where you are right now.
So I've been very fortunate after serving with First Engineers. They gave me my first command opportunity, so I got to command a signal company in First ID, and then after that, you know, went and trained with the provincial reconstruction teams in Fort Liberty, which was incredible because you had these Air Force and Navy commanders that were taking these provincial reconstruction teams with a mix of Air Force, Navy, and Army people, and we were trying to integrate USAID and Department of State. So you got to see this big building of governmental agencies trying to affect social change in Afghanistan, and you know, really watching the Army transform from just a warfighting organization to a building organization for stability in theater was quite impressive, right? And it shows that our organization isn't just shooting and killing and doing all of those things. So my worldview kept getting bigger as we kept moving and transitioning and getting new jobs in the Army. I got to go to Fort Campbell. I deployed again to Afghanistan, this time as a company commander. I came back and worked in the Pentagon and, was in charge of the budget. And I got to see how politics and Congress gets involved in how we operate. So, Leon Panetta with the rescinding of the Combat Exclusion Policy, I think the Army was there a long time ago, but politically it's kind of hard to do those things because people put it on their agendas and it becomes lightning rod on whether females can be in the draft and whether females can serve in combat. It's a societal problem, not necessarily something that we are dealing with in the service. As a reflection of society, there are people that have problems with it, but as an organization, I think we were there. So after working in the Pentagon, I took command of a signal battalion, which was amazing. It was the best experience I've ever had, being in charge of 500 people and, supporting their readiness and their careers and doing missions all over the world. And then I got assigned in Korea, worked on the 8th Army staff, love Asia, want to go back there again. Got to work for an incredible general officer, General Burleson, who's one of those, throughout the podcast, you hear all of these men who are advocates for, the people who are just the best at the job, regardless of gender or anything else, very much like Colonel Brinkley. He's one of those people, so he pulled me up to be his executive officer, which is, I'm very grateful for, because I think it's what eventually got me promoted to colonel, was having that opportunity and experience. And then we came here to Fort Bragg and working on the FORSCOM staff and staying in right now to see what the future holds and supporting Merlin in his career. So just amazing experiences. And now, being in the forums that I'm in, I'm getting to see how the Army is continuing to adapt and transform as we look at a different operating environment with Ukraine and what's going on in Israel.
Right. And that, I think you bring up an important point that, for a while, as an organization, it wasn't, I won't speak for the Marines, but for the Army, it wasn't really an issue. I mean, there could always be individual people, but it was more of a political thing. And that's something that, talking to Lori Manning, that she was continually monitoring. And I think that was like the impediment for a while. But do you, just because you're at Fort Liberty right now, do you see, the young women coming in and just sort of, I know they do special training, special ops is somewhere on Fort Liberty, am I right?
It is, but they are compartmentalized on the post. So
Okay,
I actually don't have a lot of interaction with them, and I don't unfortunately get to that level very often to see the integration across the military.
Wow, it really has changed. The whole arc of your careers really reflects that. Anyway, that's how I see it on the outside looking in. And are you aware of there's legislation in Congress right now where they're trying to sort of retroactively, it's called the JAX Act, and they're retroactively trying to recognize first the cultural support teams, which seems to have had more actual like paperwork representing who participated and who didn't, like what they did and everything. But they want to also, there's some women veteran advocates who are trying to see if they can get the Lionesses and the female engagement teams also recognized in that. Are you guys aware of that legislation?
I only became aware when you told me about it.
Okay. Well, it's
fun-
ongoing, so we'll see.
It's fantastic. I think it's a little problematic in that, at least back, to Shannon's time, it's based on how good record keeping was, at our level. I had 25 women assigned or attached to us, and all but one went on a mission. But I have my books, my commander books from back in the day, and I still have them. So I have, everything I'm doing day by day with names and bumper numbers associated with that. It would probably be pretty challenging because there wasn't a Lioness military occupational specialty on the books. It was somebody's additional duty.
Right.
So that could be challenging. I could see how that could be challenging on trying to figure that out for some people.
Right. I mean, I think it's like the catch-22.
Mhm.
If technically you weren't supposed to be doing it, like in terms of how it was represented in the political world, then you're not going to have the records that you would need. But anyway, I've just mentioned that because it's just an interesting case, because I know they've been listening to the podcast to, members of Congress and their staff to listen. Not that we're just giving an overview of and the progression of it, but certainly there are many women who who participated. But the numbers are still relatively small. If they just did it, it probably wouldn't, it's not going to put a dent in anything, I don't think, in terms of money or anything. But hopefully it's something that serious people are working on really hard. It would be really tremendous. But hopefully, the one thing that I was also fascinated with, talking to some of the women who participated, say, in the cultural support team members, is that they still had, even though they trained for it. And as you saw in one of those episodes, Kate, you mentioned, like, yeah, they went to Sephora as part of their training to kind of just like interact with people. Who'd have thought? And yet they still had to go over there, and it was separate from their MOS. And then they had to come back and be in, return to their regular jobs, where there was no real acknowledgement, because people didn't really know about it. And so it was like this idea of women having two jobs. So hopefully now, depending on, I don't know how the world goes, everybody can just have one job, or they can have the job they were trained for.
Yeah, for sure.
I have another question for you guys. Looking back, I am amazed now when I think back. Like, I think Meg and I knew, like, wow, you were, we had done all this research, and we knew you were the women who we wanted to talk to, who we thought could represent the situation and had the stories to tell. But I'm constantly amazed that you said yes, that you allowed us to come out and film you. And I just want to, like, acknowledge that, because it just seemed, when I look at the film now, parts of it still, really, your stories touch me. And I'm just like, I can't even imagine what it would be like if I, for me, like, if anyone came to me and said I wanted to film, I don't have anything to say about it. But what was that like? How hard a decision was it? Because for all of you, it just seems like, wow. I'm so glad you said yes, but.
For me particularly, I was sitting at my desk at company command and working late when I got the phone call. I'm surprised they caught me at my desk, saying that, hey, PAO has this thing going on. You need to come down and get interviewed. So it did not feel like an option at the time. It felt like a direction. So, I went down. It was a little bit surprising because I think, you were at First Engineers and you had the camera set up in the interview room and sit down and the lights are there and you start asking questions. But because it felt sanctioned and I was in an official setting, it was very, I felt safe to talk about it. And then you and Meg with the presentation, it's just very easy to talk to both of you. So the story just kind of came out. And it was good to talk about it because, most of the time, and I'm sure the other Lionesses has that same experience, they're not opportunities to discuss what happened. So it was actually kind of cathartic too, because you deal with, the guilt. We lost so many people during that deployment of coming home and having experiences that other people don't really understand. So it was nice to be able to discuss it and then continue to meet up. And then it helped keep all of the Lionesses connected. So, being able to reconnect with Rebecca and with Shannon throughout the years at these events or, talking on Zoom for this has been incredible.
Good. Well, I'm glad. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that did surprise us, I think, and is an interesting thing. I mean, I think it's all changed dramatically now, but in 2003, 2004, when we were getting started, and we were early on before we'd connected with you, we'd gone down to Fort Liberty now, but Fort Bragg then a couple of times. And when we were just saying we wanted to do stories, we knew roles that women were playing in the military right now were changing over in Iraq. And we were interested in profiling. And I found that the leadership down at Fort Bragg then, Fort Liberty now, was very open to that focus. I mean, I had to write lots of permissions to get the okay, but they were very open to that, just like, uplifting women. And I think must have been some sense of that. They were proud to some extent, and they didn't mind. They were very open to the press early on I mean, a lot of, I think, journalists did embed as they went over. Is that how it seemed to you?
Yeah, I think from my standpoint, again, the Army being a learning organization, the public affairs community at large just got better at this. So if it's a good story and it's showing success, let's highlight it. Let's be the story. Let's be a part of it. Let's allow it to happen. And let's participate in the storytelling. I think, similar to Stacy, I think when I was stationed at Fort Riley and got the call to participate in an interview, I felt I was voluntold to do that, which is fine. So I went and participated, but I think early on in meeting, you and Meg were very lovable and you created a very safe environment for us. But I think all 5 of us felt we were only a very small portion of a much bigger story. And then you guys kept coming back. And then we were like, what exactly is going on? And really, I don't think until you screened it in New York City and had us all there, did we realize what we participated in. And I think we were all just like silent, like we didn't know what to say. We were shocked, but excited and I think honored to be a part of it.
Yeah, we were honored. We felt like we were had something we had to take great care of as we told it. And I know, Shannon, I think I was a voice out of the blue when your mother picked up the phone in Arkansas. And I'm like, I'm going to speak to Shannon.
Yeah, I was actually out of town and my mom called me and she said, Shannon, there's these people from New York trying to get a hold to you. And I was like, oh God, who do I owe money to? That was my first thought. And then she's like, no, they want to talk to you about what you did in Iraq on those Lioness missions. And I was like, oh God, well, yeah, we can talk about it. You know, we'd already done that article for Army Times, and I
Right.
thought, well, this must be coming off of that. I had no idea that you guys actually wanted to do a film at that point. And then I was like, I just don't want to misrepresent Arkansas, but then I've got plenty of predecessors before me that have already done that, so I'm good. And I decided to be a part of it. I wanted to make sure that what took place to me at the VA never took place for another female when she comes in with PTSD and problems and needing help. I just wanted to make sure nobody else was ever turned away and that they knew we were out there doing what we're doing.
Right. And I mean, I think, you know, we went to we first spoke, I think Colonel Brinkley was at the Army War College in Pennsylvania at the time. And so we went down there, like before we talked to you, we talked to him, and we had a very in-depth interview with him. And we were sweating bullets because we had some sense that if he thinks we're okay, you know, like his word is probably going to count. If he's like, don't talk to these people, you know, you probably might not have said yes. So, but we found him like an amazing storyteller and just full of and ready to talk. So we were, I mean, it was like a great interview. And then we went, before we met you in Kansas, we talked to Colonel Cabry. And so and I think hopefully that helped. And I know there were phone calls between, he was at Fort Leavenworth at the time, yeah. And I know, and then we were driving to Fort Riley. And I know there were phone calls before we got in the car to go. They were like, yeah, they should be okay. So just from our perspective, we felt like we were definitely jumping through some hoops, but it was, you know, it was very challenging in a fun way. So, is there anything in the film that when you look at now, you're like, I wish I could have said this, or that's not quite it, or anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think when I go back and see it, and I usually go back and try and watch it prior to something like this, which these types of events don't occur as frequently as they used to. I think I was still a little guarded. You know, at the time I was, 30 years old. I was a young captain. I still wasn't sure what, people outside of our organization thought, nor did I really care. I was just trying to do my job and go home at night. So I think I was a little guarded. I kept good journals. I kept good commander's books there and have a lot of detail on a lot of things that I don't think I shared sometimes when we had conversations. Just to be careful,
Right.
never to put somebody else in the position that they felt uncomfortable with something that I may or may not say. There were some things covered in the film, where we talked about an event, but it probably didn't go down exactly like it was portrayed in the film. And that's okay, because it protected or shielded somebody that may have been affected otherwise. So I think I just go back and I think maybe I was a little guarded. Maybe I would have said some additional things. Maybe you would have used some additional content. I think part of that is in a documentary, finding that safe spot with somebody, but while you're still on active duty, it's a little more complex. Shannon is pretty outspoken to begin with, but she was also removed from the Army, during a lot of the filming, and the rest of us weren't. And I think to some degree, we're a little nervous, about what we could say and what we couldn't say. And then when you talk about combat in general or losing people over there, that's also just something very difficult and challenging to discuss and dialogue about, I think. Not knowing how it'll get used, or how it will be received, I guess. So that's what I
Yeah.
think is that, you know, I could have shared more. I wish I would have shared more. But at the time I probably shared what I could share.
Well, I mean, Shannon, because you were out, you were able to share so much, and like we took that as like a sacred duty to treat that so carefully in the film. But Kate and Stacy, I have to say, like, you did open up your journals to us and you both read, and those were just fantastic. And it was almost like a film doesn't have to have everything. It can't have everything. It can only be so long, and a film can't be all the history, because that's what a book can be. But a film has to really deliver like an emotional context, a kind of like a psychological geography of what it was like. And I think that's, you shared enough so that we were able to create that to the extent that we at the time, we only knew so many questions to ask. I mean, it was like when you're doing it, you know, we did the best we could, and you answered. I mean, how do you feel about that, Stacy? Because you really did share some wonderful journal entries as well as Kate.
I'm not as prepared as Kate, so I did not rewatch the film before the podcast. But I don't recall any time that I've seen it or talked about it having any regrets or wishing I had said something different. It captured a moment in time, and
Right.
like I said, I felt comfortable sharing with you what had happened. You know, maybe like Kate was saying, we're a little bit more guarded on what our opinions were for the future because we just didn't know the environment that we were in, and perhaps what it meant or should mean. But you know, you captured what we went through very realistically. But like Kate, when we saw the film, I think we were all a little bit surprised it was just the 5 of us, because we were expecting to be a small part of a story of like 24 people, rather than it be focused. But I understand for narrative purposes, it makes more sense not to divide it up amongst, you know, 24 different people. But you know, looking back, I definitely don't regret participating in it, and I don't look back and wish I had said something differently or done something differently.
Well, just to give context to that, so you can understand, when the film was finished, before anyone really saw it beyond the people, you know, in the editing and our producers, we rented out actually a theater, a fairly big theater in Midtown, and we flew all the women in. And so it was the 5 women in our film, and myself and Meg, and we sat down and we watched it, and there was no one else in the theater, and because we just wanted them to have that sense that, what do you think? And if anyone was highly disturbed or concerned about anything, we were still in a position to some extent adapt or change or deal with it. But we wanted to like do that. And I will say that Meg and I, you know, we're just from a completely other perspective of like camera shoots and this and that. And we're so far in our world, we're like, what do you mean you didn't think it was going to be, there were other people? That was it. That was it. You guys were it. Didn't you get that? But we had a good laugh about that in a way. But it's so interesting to us because that larger filmmaking process in these stories, you know, it's just completely different perspectives and 2 different jobs. You're not seeing them from, you know, you're not necessarily seeing it from the same way, especially at that time. I mean, everybody's making films now and everything's captured and everything's edited. So I think there's a lot more familiarity with the process now. But, you know, back then, anyway, I remember that time. That's a seminal moment in my life for you guys, with you. So what do you think, Shannon? Are we covering everything?
I was just gonna say, if I would have known that I was going to end up in so many OIF, OEF, PTSD groups with Marines, I probably would have rephrased my opinion about them a little better. I'm just going to say, because that has caught me some flack from time to time.
Well, I don't know if I've ever told you the story, but you know, I will say that Colonel Kennedy, at the time, he was very accessible, and he was not hard to get, and he was very open to having us talk to him, and even and also a lot of, because they had his one of his sort of his right-hand guy had brought a little video camera from home and taken a lot of that footage when they were in Ramadi. And
Yeah.
they had, you know, he had all these tapes, and he had, I think he was teaching at a sniper school in Texas at the time, near Waco. And so I called him, and I was, you know, and Colonel Kennedy had said, oh yeah, you know, maybe, you know, he's got all this footage. So I was calling him, finally we set up this meet in a hotel room in Washington. And like, he flew in, we had dinner, and I was like trying to be real nice. And we just want it. We're just going to use it just to, like, you know, show what was going on. And he was like, well, I don't know. This was Friday night. I don't know. We'll see. I don't want to get burned by it. How are you going to use it? You know, I was very reticent. So we had this long dinner of like telling him my life story, everything like that. So then I said, well, you know, I have a little editing set up in my hotel room. So come tomorrow morning and I'll show you, and we can look through the footage together. So he came in Saturday morning, and he had an old brown bag with just tons and tons of tapes. And he's like, here, just take it. Don't make me look bad, and send it back. That was it. And that was, you know, I mean, that was just great, because that helped us sort of use that footage to create the atmosphere that had gone on in April, in 2004, April, March, whatever, in the whole, when the Marines got there. So, I mean, the Marines were, they were many things, but they were also very helpful when it came to making the film. I definitely appreciate that. They were very open, and it was all good. And afterwards, Colonel Kennedy called up and said, you know, it's the fog of war. We don't always see everything the same way necessarily, but you did a good job. So I thought, fair enough.
Yeah, that footage I thought was incredible. You know, and when we had friends watch the film, they asked where the film came from, and they're like, how did somebody have that much time in his role to capture all that footage? Because it's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Right.
Does the Army have good footage like that of our maneuver?
I have no idea. I've never seen footage like that. You know, at the time, you know, we didn't have a public affairs officer in our organization. People were fulfilling that role as like an additional duty and really not doing a whole lot with it back in 2003.
Yeah. I mean, I think when divots formed, they were very helpful. And believe it or not, when you guys know what divots is, right? Okay, so but when they were just forming in 2004 or 5, I think, and I actually called them up and I gave them a shot list for Ramadi that I wanted, and they had someone on the ground go and shoot the shots that I wanted. So I felt like it was a second unit. Of course, they won't do that now. It's completely closed off, but it was just part of I feel like a real openness at the time to, which was kind of amazing. I mean, you won't see that again, I don't think.
No, and we started, you know, deploying a lot of the mobile public affairs detachments back then, because as the Guard and Reserve forces were rotating in and out, they had a lot of those assets that active duty didn't have. And, because of rotation fatigue, you had a lot of these public affairs units going over there. So we learned and we got better at it, as we went along. And we learned that we need to make it accessible for people and help tell the story.
And I wanted to ask though about, because one of the things in doing the podcast that I was surprised to learn, but yes, there were a lot of people in the Army, in fact, who did think that Team Lioness and the Lioness program originated with the Marines. And like, how did that happen?
That is a good question on where it started. I think part of it was, the 4 women, Army women, ended up on the cover of the Marine Times, which was crazy, right? So people who weren't familiar with the military probably didn't even recognize the fact that those were Army soldiers on the cover. So that is my first understanding of kind of how it hit print, and you have their faces. And then I think the Marines started telling the story. It was successful. They were having some success with it. They start owning and telling the story. We did not. And there was a vacuum within the Army of talking about it and highlighting it. And then I think, it grew some feet and carried. And then, there wasn't anybody high enough up, I think, to correct the record, or there wasn't a need or a feeling that they needed to correct the record. I have always felt that there needs to be a correction of the record, because, without a doubt, when you watch films or there's dialogue about FETs and CSTs, they always talk about the Marines. The Lioness film talks about, she's a Marine, but they do a nice little nod in the very first episode of Sheridan's, show, where they say it started off as an Army program. So
they do. It's like a 20-second conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, no, they do. This is a 20-second origin story planted within there. So
that's right. But it was not the Marines' idea. And the Marines, I will tell you, pushed back on this idea until there was demonstrated success by 1-5 Field Artillery and Colonel Cabry and Colonel Brinkley. And at the time, it was Buck Connor, who was our brigade commander. And once we started having success, it was kind of pushed on the Marines a little bit more to make them more successful through the brigade leadership, in my opinion, is kind of what I saw on the ground. And they were super nervous about doing it in the beginning, the Marine Corps was. But as they, grew successful and figured out how to integrate them properly, then they got used more and more. But, no doubt that, Shannon and Stone were the first 2 women to participate in one of those missions.
Wow. Anyway, it's really amazing. But anyway, I think for some reason, I've had more response in terms of getting that fact across from the podcast than from the film. So go figure. Well, before we go, I was just hoping that if, starting with Kate, you could tell us what you've been doing after you've retired in 2020. And I know you were the editor-in-chief at the Army Times Press, or just Army Press?
Yep, Army University Press.
Army University Press. And how did you get to that role from being a PAO for so long? Working in public affairs.
Yeah, I think, because I was in the engineer unit as a company commander, I was an engineer for the first decade of my career. And I transitioned into public affairs, as we talked about earlier, family life, Army life, in thinking that I wouldn't compete with my husband for any jobs and that we would flip-flop deployments and never have to deploy simultaneously. I became a public affairs officer, almost, taking a back seat and different career path to make that work. So in doing the public affairs gig, I did some of that in Hawaii, and then I ended up in the Pentagon. And then it was time for my husband to take a higher level command in the Corps of Engineers at the time. And I was getting promoted to colonel, and the only public affairs billet in the area at the 06 level happened to be at Fort Leavenworth, responsible for the Army University Press at the time. Now I think that position can get filled by pretty much any skill set. It's just a leadership role. But it just worked. Doug was working out of the federal building down in Kansas City, and then I was up at Fort Leavenworth. And at the time I deployed for a year to Afghanistan as well. And the press is kind of a multimedia organization. So, you know, they take manuscripts on and publish them. At the time, the Combined Arms Center commander wanted us to start making movies, highlighting Army doctrine, because the new soldier learned through media versus reading. So we started making films when I was there, which was insanity.
So Kate turned filmmaker.
Yeah, it was crazy. He's like, go make a movie and highlight Army doctrine. And we're all looking at each other like, what? But it worked, and they're doing it really, really well now. And then, you know, one of the things I think Doug and I are proud about is, you know, we knew as we got higher up in the Army, and Stacy will attest to it, how challenging it is to have some work-life balance. And we decided that we would exit the Army on our own terms when we feel good about it. So we could have stayed in and kept going and trying to juggle it all. But I had one of my two children really struggled with my last deployment when I went to Afghanistan when she was little. And we just knew that it was time to kind of put family first, and find other things. And because, you know, we love Colorado and the outdoors, we decided we'd try Colorado, and if we didn't like it, we'd go somewhere else. My dad, who was a Vietnam veteran, suffered from Agent Orange related Parkinson's, and my parents moved out near us, and I helped take care of him the last couple of years. And when he passed away, I finally decided it's time to start re-engaging and find something professionally to do, because as my kids get older and more independent, they don't need me now as much, you know. So I just started doing some other things, and I substitute teach in the local school district. I do a lot of volunteerism. And I started recently working for another West Point grad who runs a company called Authentically American, which is 100% American-made apparel. And he's small staffed, but they make a great product that's loved by a lot of military and veterans. And he gives back to veteran support organizations and donates to them. And he's all about, you know, minimizing his carbon footprint and employing American workers. I like being a part of it. So I'm only doing 2 to 10 hours for him a week, but it's fun. It's teaching me how to maximize my minutes to be as impactful as I possibly can in a short amount of time, which is fun and unique challenge. But I'm thinking about getting back into something bigger as well, and just starting to explore options. But I did just crash on a ski slope on January 7th, and I have a bad MCL, ACL, and a fracture. So I go back to the surgeon in a couple of weeks, and I probably have to get some knee surgery in there too.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
Okay.
It's because I'm turning 50 this year.
Well, there you go.
Listen, that MCL, ACL, I'm going to blame Uncle Sam for that. I mean,
Exactly.
I went through that 4 years ago, got them both in the same time. Yeah.
Oh Lord. Oh
Wow.
yikes.
Well, we'll give a shout out in the write-up to Authentically American.
Thank you.
And put up the website so people can access it if they're at our program. And so before we go, Stacy, as a sign off, do you want to talk to us about are you in Merlin? You've got your life there, your 2 daughters. Are you just going to see how it goes? Or, I mean, it's like a question that puts you on the spot. Please feel like you don't have to answer it, but
I mean, honestly, I can be very open about this. So making 06, you know, the way the retirement system works, I've got at least 2 more years. I have been selected for Senior Service College, which is a degree making program, and it's a year at one of the war colleges. So, and there's a utilization tour after that. So I'll be in for a few more years. I'm looking forward to Merlin and I got Senior Service College together, which is amazing. So this summer we will move to somewhere, because they haven't published the locations yet. So we know we've got this thing coming, but don't know if we'll be in DC or in Pennsylvania. But we've got, at least 2 more moves and a couple more assignments, and we'll see where the Army takes us. Merlin is doing amazing. The sky's the limit for him. So for me, it's the decision of whether I want to hang up my hat and follow him around, but I kind of like having my own Army identity. So as long as we're able to keep the family together, I plan to continue serving.
That's fantastic. And now, Shannon, I'm going to put you on the spot and make you tell us about where you are, because we know you moved.
I did. I'm actually right outside of Buffalo, New York now. I just moved up here to start my journey of my new life. As soon as I get established, I'm planning on getting that nonprofit going. I want to pick up where I left off. I feel like my life, my former life, just kind of put me in a stalemate for a while, but I'm ready to get back to it and help out where I can. There's lots of veteran organizations here and a lot of different service centers, and I just want to help out and volunteer where I can be used.
That sounds fantastic. And you look great. I'm really happy to see you. And we're in the same state, different ends of the same state, but we're in the same state. So that's a start. I want to thank you, all of you, for coming and participating with me on this kind of look back, look forward episode. It meant a lot to me. I was really looking forward to it. You're like people I've known, I've known you. You've always been with me in the film. Our collaboration was probably the most intense film collaboration that I've had, and extended outwards in advocacy work and led for me to a lot of other kinds of work. And so you're like all really important in my life. But not that I see you every day, but just to be in touch with you now is really incredible. And I couldn't do it without the Veterans Breakfast Club support of this podcast, and Sean, who is absolutely amazing, loves all our stories. And Sean, do you have a question? I don't want to totally leave you out.
No worries. I'm just I'm very honored to listen in and be a part of this in any way. And I feel like if I started diving into my questions, we'd be here another hour. So I'll let this sit for itself. It's been a fantastic episode today.
All right. Well, thank you very much.